Ladies and gentlemen, the fabulous Ranulph Fiennes.
Yeah, well, that was sort of half true. The bit about not listening to my wife was definitely not true. Anything she says, I immediately do. Anything she says I mustn't do, I immediately don't do. But basically, I would like to be partisan and just thank, well done everybody with the prizes, but I particularly would like to thank whoever Bristol is for saving my life anyway. I had a massive heart attack, Bristol Airport, on an aeroplane that hadn't quite taken off. They took me to the A&E, double bypass, 3 days, 13 attempts to make it tick until it eventually did tick on the third day. They couldn't say why I had the heart attack at all, and to this day I don't know. I was on EasyJet, but apart from that, no thing. So a big thank you to Bristol. I'm just going to talk for about a few minutes to explain why I do as a profession what I do. And I have to say that other talk that Roy was talking about, that was with pictures and a PowerPoint, which is totally different to doing it with nothing apart from ad lib. Anyway, I'd like to explain why I chose as a profession to do something which nobody pays you for. I basically didn't know that until after it was too late. But that is it. We plan, our group, to break world records of a geographical and physical nature against all comers, particularly the enemy. I'm talking about the Norwegians, who basically have caused us a lot of trouble over 40 years. Our group, basically, if we add up the number of records that we've failed, is about 40%, but we do include as failure when we have broken the existing world record but not got to the final goal. If you do get to the final goal, whether it's the pole or whatever, what you do is you make a lot of noise about it in the media, because that is what your sponsor wants, and to us the sponsor is God. Also, if you get there, obviously you stick your flag there before anybody else puts their flag in the same place, especially the French. And I would say, if we have been any good at doing it over the years, it is probably due to the selection of the individual people on the team. And I'm talking about 52 people from 9 different countries, maybe chief engineers on the icebreaker, if that expedition has got an icebreaker or whatever. They have been with us, these guys. They've got nothing in common at all, other than the fact that I have never paid anybody anything at any time. So there's no financial incentive. Nonetheless, they are still coming 38 years later. Obviously, quite a few are dead, so they're not, but the other ones are sort of... I think that the most important thing when I'm selecting them, which I used to do by myself, is not their characteristics or anything like complicated like that. It's just their motivational factor, because how a person is motivated is how they behave for themselves and therefore for their expedition or their company or whatever. So before an interview, I need a clear definition of motivation. And I don't know if you remember a famous Irish psychologist called Anthony Clare. He was asked to define motivation in a single sentence. He obviously did not do that, because the Irish cannot define anything in a single sentence. But what he did say is that motivation is something which happens to everybody when they're a teenager. They go to university, they meet a professor who they respect, who one day says something illuminating to them which sticks in their head and forms the basis of their motivation through life thereafter, which is obviously a load of rubbish. In fact, how you are motivated is the sum total of everything which has happened to you personally since you were little and how you reacted to it, or possibly even before you were little. It may be genetic. If you're born stupid, you'll probably stay stupid. If you go to school and you get badly bullied, this can have a big effect on how you interact socially for a long time, even if you don't know it. And I think this system of only choosing people on their motivation normally works very well indeed, except I have been in a hostile area with somebody for 2 months and thought they were brilliant, and then noticed a flaw in their character which could be dangerous later on. And I have to say, in our team, what we do if we notice this sort of thing is we sack them immediately. None of this sort of sideways British promotional pussyfooting, which just keeps your rotten apple in the barrel. Basically, I think from my own point of view, probably goes back to when I got born in Windsor, outside the castle, obviously, at a time when it was being bombed during the war, which my mother did not like. So she moved all of my sisters and me, aged 1, out to South Africa for 12 years without consulting us. And I have to say, it was a very nice place to get brought up, except that academically it was way behind the UK. Today it may be the other way around, but that's the way it was. So when we all got back here, I was 12 years old, my mum had no money, she was looking for somewhere to educate us, and was very happy when she found a place called Winchester College, which took anybody totally free of charge if your family name was Fiennes. This was because the bloke that built the college 800 years ago had been called Fiennes and liked the idea of lots of little Fienneses going there free. And also in those days there were very few of us, so it was economically safe for the college. But more recently we started to breed like rabbits, mostly actors, and it became unsafe for the college. So they changed the rules, and after that you could only get in free if you got the top level of entrance exam. And due to my African background, I got the bottom level and they would not accept me, to my mother's disappointment. In fact, the only place which would take people with such a low level of intelligence was, of course, Eton College. So I went there for about 5 years, but my level was so low I couldn't even keep up with theirs. But luckily there was boxing, which did not require too much intelligence, and also, of course, stegophily. Stegophily is if you get born with an edifice complex, meaning you like to climb tall edifices at night in order to put things on top to annoy the school authorities. And over those 5 years at Eton, I learned, I think in the 1950s, British architects stopped using proper steel drain pipes outside buildings like you got here, switched to nasty plastic ones which very often break when you get up to the 6th floor. So from an academic viewpoint, therefore, Eton was not a total waste of time. But going back to motivation, my mother realized that if I stayed there, I would never be able to do the only thing that I wanted to do since I was little, which was to become the commanding officer of the Royal Scots Greys Cavalry Regiment, which my dad had been commanding when he got killed in the war. Now in his day, the regiment had 600 grey horses, quite romantic, and also in order to get to be a regular British officer, Sandhurst, you did not require things called A-levels. But by the time I arrived on the scene, the regiment had switched from horses to tanks, even though it was the British Army, and also you couldn't get to Sandhurst if you did not get your A-levels. So my mother removed me from Eton, because she knew if I stayed there I would not get them. The place is badly designed for getting people A-levels. And I was sent to a famous place in Brighton called Davis's. And if you went there, when you came out the other end, you definitely had your A-levels. And I'm not at all proud of having broken their record. This was not my fault, because at that time was the height of the mini-skirt era, and concentration was therefore not possible. So I failed the A-levels twice. But if you can't get what you want, like Sandhurst, you've got to find a parallel route. And I found a place in Aldershot called Mons Cadet School. And if you went there for 5 months and could prove to the Sergeant Major that under a situation of great stress you could dig holes in straight lines, you could become an officer in the British Army. So I did this and I got sent out to Germany. It was the Cold War at that time, and I spent the next 5 years in tanks learning how to retreat from the German border. Did not practice advancing, which got pretty tedious. So when I saw a notice on the regimental board asking for officers to apply for the SAS, I put my name down, not because I knew anything about the SAS. In those days, nobody had ever heard of them. It was before Harold Wilson started to use them for PR purposes. I had obviously heard of Scandinavian Airlines services, but So I got sent to Hereford, which is where you go to get selected for the unit, and I found there were 190 soldiers trying to get in, 30 other officers, pretty much all of them built like brick houses, ex-paras. None of them came from a cavalry regiment. They called me a donkey walloper. So, to be honest, I was quite happy when this lot got ruthlessly eliminated in only 10 days, down to only 3 soldiers and 2 officers. And to my surprise, I was still there. I think probably because they were choosing people from a physical, not intelligence point of view. But sadly, on the 11th day, they switched. So I had to try to become alert. And I can remember, if you failed anything, you got thrown out immediately. And what me and the other remaining officer were having to do one night was to cross the local river outside Hereford by night in winter with no clothes on for some military reason. So I woke up extremely knackered the following morning at about 11 o'clock. You're meant to get up at 6 o'clock, and I panicked because they leave your instructions every day on your bed. And what it was that particular day was to steal £200,000 from the local bank in Hereford in great detail, which the SAS check after. I had Barclays, the other officer had Lloyds. So I rushed down to the town, but the bank was already closed, so I could not get in to do a careful burglary plan. So I went round the back and I banged on the back window, and luckily the bank manager came out. He was a charming bloke, very naive. I explained I had come from Germany. I was trying to get into the SAS. I had brought all my family silver with me. This bit was not true. And he said, no problem, we at Barclays are extremely secure. He showed me all the electronic burglar system, so I thanked him. And in those days, carbon paper, I copied the bank raid plan in great detail, one copy to the SAS just in time, and me and the other bloke had the day off, so we went up to Birmingham, we saw a film and had a spaghetti dinner, and very stupidly after dinner, I left my copy of the bank raid plan in the restaurant. And the manager, later in court, basically gave the plans to the police. There was a ministerial inquiry in Westminster, front page of the Times, why SAS officers were stealing from banks. I was up before the commanding officer, who basically said any more behave like this and I would be thrown out of the SAS immediately. Well, for the next year or two, I behaved pretty well in different parts of the world, doing different things. But briefly, back in the UK, unfortunately, I got phoned by an old Eton friend who, by that time, like most of them, had become a wine salesman in the West Country. And during the course of selling his stuff in pubs down there, he had discovered a village called Castle Combe, which had just been voted Europe's prettiest village by the Americans. And it was being attacked by 20th Century Fox, making a film in this beautiful village called Dr. Dolittle, which involved turning trout stream thatched cottages into a dirty Great Lake with a 20-foot concrete dam, ruining the village. And my friend decided to bring this outrage to the general attention by blowing up the entire concrete dam the night before the film started, which is a good PR plan. Unfortunately, the police got to hear about it. They put Alsatian dogs all over the dam, but my friend had been at Eton, so he was up to that one. What he did was to rent 8 Alsatian bitches in order to put them upwind of the dam. But at the last minute, the bitches failed to turn up, so he phoned me to ask if I would stand in. Because I had just completed an army explosives course where you learn to blow up as much as you can using as little as possible. And I was pretty good at this, so I had a lot left over at the end of every day. And it seemed stupid to give it back to Her Majesty, so I put it in the boot. And 2 months later, the boot was full and sweating. And what better way of getting rid of it than this public spirited gesture? Unfortunately, everybody was caught. I was not physically caught. I'd been doing another army course on how to escape from dogs by night. But they had the car numbers. I ended up in Chippenham Prison. I was on police probation for 6 months. I was thrown out of the SAS back to my own regiment, who was still retreating from the German border. Well, I put up with that for about another year, and then I saw a notice asking for officers to apply for SAF. You may be too young to remember, but back then it wasn't jihadis, it was Marxists all over the world. They had just chucked the Brits out of the Yemen and were about to move into the Oman in order to block 80% of the free world's oil coming out of the Gulf. So the socialist prime minister here agreed to send the Sultan of Oman a massive show of military strength, which he did. There were about 9 of us at that time. I can remember applying in Edinburgh to the colonel of the regiment for the job, but all the other applicants were coming out looking unhappy because they'd been turned down due to being too valuable to the regiment. But my application went through immediately. What the Ministry of Defence think is you cannot command Arabs in the dark being shot at by communists if you can't speak Arabic. So first of all, you get sent to the best place in the world for learning Arabic, according to the ministry, which is Beaconsfield in North London. I did fail the course, but I was still sent out. And on arrival, you meet your, shall we say, works team for the first time. And I have to say they were a piratical-looking group. Most of them were, in fact, Baluchi, so they could only speak Urdu. Many of them were Zanzibaris, only spoke Swahili. And the few that did speak Arabic had not been to Beaconsfield. So we ended with a major communications problem. But basically, I think it was out there that I began to get a taste for travel in very remote parts of the world. 3 years after serving the Sultan, I had to leave, not because I wanted to, but because I was thrown out of the British Army because of the previous lack of A-levels, no Sandhurst, no regular commission. 8 years was your lot. So 1968, I found myself untrained. You know, you don't get a job because you've been in a 60-ton Conqueror tank for 5 years. And basically, I got married at the time. Ginny, my late wife for 40 years, she also had no money really, worked for the Scottish National Trust. So all we could do, we decided, was to try to do what I had been doing in Germany in the Cold War, which was to teach Scottish soldiers how to canoe and climb and ski, because they got bored stiff waiting for the Soviet army to attack, which we were waiting for. So they started beating each other up instead in the NAFI. So I was there to teach them canoeing and all that. Well, Ginny thought in that case we would turn that to civilian expeditions. Unfortunately, that stuff in Germany was paid for by the taxpayer. Doing it with your wife was not. So the new word then and now was sponsorship. We started by 1968 looking for the great lost city of frankincense from Dhofar in South Oman. Between then and 26 years later, Ginny and I did 8 major expeditions into the greatest sand desert in the world in Arabia before we finally found the lost city 300 miles into the dunes, which, if you go out there today, is the biggest excavation works in Arabia. Early on, Ginny and I started doing little expeditions. Nobody had heard of us. Getting sponsorship was very, very difficult. We had to persuade people to give us equipment. Anyway, we started, just to give you 2 examples. One was the first, she decided what we would do at breakfast, basically. We would go up the longest river in the world, 4,000 miles long, I'm talking about the Nile, and that we would use 2-seater hovercraft. This is 1968, pioneer hovercraft called Hover Hawks, because in the Guinness Book, Ginny had read that they had the world record of having hovered for 8 hours around a gravel pit without a breakdown. So obviously the right model for the Nile. They had 3 motorbike engines which could lift them 2 centimeters above the surface. We took 9 months to complete the Nile, partly because there were a lot of 4-centimeter obstacles. Just out of 34 early expeditions, I just mentioned one more, which was basically the British Columbian government, Western Canada, British Columbia being bigger than 3 Great Britons, but full of deep forests and the Rocky Mountains, were having their centenary of being a Canadian province. And because they'd been discovered by Scotsmen, they wanted a Scottish expedition to try to do the first ever 2,000-mile journey by 9 of the roughest rivers in the world from their Yukon border down through the Rockies to their southern border at Vancouver in the United States. I was chosen to lead it because I was on the Army Reserve by then, in return for which the ministry promised me a support Land Rover, BER. I later discovered that meant beyond economical repair. They said if I went to Edinburgh, I could choose out of 600 soldiers in the regiment the best 3. When I got there, I found they'd all been posted to Ireland apart from the cooks, so the choice was not good. But I found a very fine Scotsman called Joseph Skabinski, and the 3 of them were given a total of 6 weeks annual leave, We took 8 months, so they were not popular when they got back. You might think, if you're cynical, and you look, I have to say, quite a cynical lot, you might think this is indicative of bad planning on my part, but it wasn't. It was because none of us had ever been on rough water before in rubber boats, and yet the ministry only gave us training rights on the Thames at Henley. So when we got to Canada, the roughest rivers in the world, our learning curve was very steep. We had 4 boats, 3 people in each boat, and on Hell's Gate we hit a 28-foot high standing wave. One of our boats was overturned. We found their bodies a mile downstream, and that could have stopped the entire expedition. But luckily it was just the BBC film crew. Round about 1971, we had a big problem because we depend on sponsors. They won't sponsor you without media coverage. And in 1971, the British media were no longer interested in hot expeditions. So you couldn't do that sort of thing. You had to go polar. So Ginny decided at breakfast that we would have to ambitiously become polar acquainted. We had been winter in Inverness, but she was after big polar stuff, you know, beat the Norwegians and all that. She decided we would do the first ever journey vertically around Earth for 52,000 miles without flying 1 meter, going through both poles and crossing both ice caps. Sent me to a library to find out the best route. I discovered that there was a white bit at the bottom called Antarctica, which nobody had ever crossed in a single expedition from one side to the other. I'm talking about the world's polar experts. This did not look good. There was another problem up at the top, the Arctic Ocean, 2,500 miles of floating ice over the North Pole. Again, never crossed completely from one side to the other. I went home, as you would, and I told my wife it was a stupid idea. She became quite unpleasant, so I therefore went back to the library. But basically, if you want to be sponsored, you've got to be first. We knew that the great American polar man, Walt Pedersen, was desperate to be first to both poles. He didn't want to go the whole way around like Ginny did, but nonetheless. But you can't be in a hurry if you have no money. We had no money. We had a Hammersmith semi-detached. We had a minivan. Ginny had a Jack Russell Terrier, and that was it. But we would need, for £2.5 million minimum, a 40-year-old icebreaker to get us to these places. We would need a ski plane to drop parachutes. We would never fly in it in remote areas. We were given an office in Sloane Square, it's now the Maurice Saatchi Gallery, by the SAS Regiment. They'd obviously forgotten what I'd been up to previously. And for 7 years, Ginny and I worked recruiting people gradually on getting it together. We had no money, we had no bank account, everything had to be sponsored. We persuaded people to give us £29 million worth of kit, 1,900 separate sponsors, every one of them wanting their goods to be photographed at some point. We worked every day, every week, every month on Ginny's dream for 7 years, finally persuaded the Foreign Office and various armies that we would be the exception to the rule, and we eventually got going. I needed at least 2 people who would be with me slowly for 3.5 years going around Earth. 800 applicants, people who were prepared for 4 years to give up their jobs for nothing, paid nothing, no expenses, people like you obviously, who would be prepared to do that. Out of 800, I chose just 2. One of them, Ollie Shepherd, who's still alive, basically was a whitbread beer salesman in Chelsea for 9 years. The other one, Charlie Burton, who's sadly dead, had been a butcher in Cape Town. The business went bust, therefore he joined the British Army. The 2 of them were ideal character-wise. You can't change characters, you can teach skills. The 2 of them joined us. We eventually set out 7 years after the date of the idea. We moved down. I'll be as quick as I possibly can, bearing in mind how rude Roy was earlier on. Basically, we got down, obviously, the Greenwich Meridian, Sahara in Land Rovers. Ship took us down to Cape Town, loaded a whole load of stuff and went down to Antarctica. We got 400 miles into Antarctica, to the edge of human exploration. It's bigger than China and India, but with no shops en route. We had to wait for 8 months, 400 miles in, on the very edge of human exploration. There were no satellites, nobody had flown over it. How did anyone know? They didn't. How high was it? Could be 12,000 feet above sea level, which we found it was. Nobody knew. It was unexplored. Anyway, we sat in a cardboard hut. Ginny designed it in Scotland 6 years earlier. They're very light, they're parachutable. When you get there, you can put them up easily. They'll crumple after 8 months, but we would only be there 8 months waiting for the next summer to come. We spent 8 months sitting inside that hut together, Charlie and Ollie up one end with the Jack Russell, me with my wife up the other end. It's quite a pleasant period, really. And eventually the sun came back, the thermometer rose to -68, so we said goodbye to the base commander, which is the nastiest job of all. That's why I gave it to Ginny, because the whole thing had been her fault for thinking of it in the first place. And unfortunately, she was a small person and couldn't roll 45-gallon drums around, so a man had to be living with my wife on and off for 2.5 years. I did not want somebody who was physically attractive in that position. But luckily, we found a Yorkshireman for that particular job. We did the first ever crossing of the entire continent. We got out the other end. We sent a Morse code message. No GPS, no sat phone, sat nav, nothing like that. Use your watch and the sun and so on, like Shackleton did, because that was what was available. The ship had been waiting in New Zealand 18 months for that Morse code message. They managed to come in. We're very lucky to see that the crew was still there, still unpaid, which was good. 2 of them were dead, but the rest were okay. Took us up New Zealand, Australia, up to the mouth of the Yukon River. The ship dropped the 3 of us off in 11-foot rubber boats. We then went up the Yukon River for 1,800 miles, down the Mackenzie River 800 miles, and switched to a single 16-foot open plastic boat to do and normally I have a map, but here there's no screen, I'm afraid. We go up the rivers, down the Northwest Passage for 2,000 miles, never done in under 3 years previously. We did it in 1 year. Unfortunately, by then, Ollie the beer salesman had dropped out. Charlie was still there. We got all the way through, and just before winter came, when you can't travel, we reached the very edge of the world. The last 400 miles over the unmapped mountains of Ellesmere Land we did on skis because the boat froze in, unfortunately, we had to abandon it. We spent 8 months again waiting for the dark period to go, again with Ginny and Charlie and the dog, and unfortunately, the dog was a pain in the neck. When we finished the expedition, it did get the Pet of the Year in the UK, and also it got into the Guinness Book of Records as the only dog ever to have peed on both poles. We said goodbye to Ginny in the dark and set out, Charlie and me, to try and do the first journey across the Arctic Ocean from side to side. After a month, the sun came up and we found ourselves on the sea ice. Very unpleasant. We got very weak, and eventually, to cut a long story short, we reached the North Pole and became the first humans to reach both poles. Still had 1,800 miles to go. To reach where the ship might rescue us above Greenland. We only got 400 miles when the breakup began, very frightening. In summer, everything's cracking up. We found a bit of ice 8 foot deep on the hand drill, put a tent up and hoped we could float for the next weeks and months towards either the Soviet Union or Greenland. And we never got bored floating south because Charlie had a solar panel which gave us enough power to listen on the radio to the BBC forecast or news or whatever for 2 minutes a day. We had enough power for that when there was reception. And I can remember one day Charlie with his headsets on, he said, "The UK is at war." So I said, "Who with?" And he said, "Oh, I didn't get that bit." We sat for 5 days of bad radio reception arguing who the hell we could be at war with. I mean, obviously we knew that Mrs. Thatcher was aggressive, but we couldn't work out who with. Of course, we assumed it was France, but when they said it was Argentina, we thought that was just a stupid BBC joke. We also did not get bored because we got visited 800 miles from human beings. When you hear scuffling outside the tent, it's quite frightening. They weigh 1.5 tons, quite a lot of them, the polar bears. One of you will go outside with a Nikon camera, the other one with a .44 Magnum revolver. The Canadian government had promised that only 10% of the Canadian polar bears eat humans, but when they're just outside, you can't ask them which percent they belong to. To cut a long story short, our ship from Greenland tried to reach us. After 4 attempts, they got stuck only 22 miles away. We eventually got on the ship, at which point human beings, for the first time ever by any route, had been vertically around Earth's surface. It's never been done again by any route. We got back, luckily the wind changed, the ice opened up, we got back to Greenwich within 2 days of the date Ginny planned 10 years previously. We kept our team together. If you've got a good team, you might as well do that. We moved on to many, many more expeditions, one of which was the first ever man-haul crossing of the Antarctic continent. Crevasses were the big problem, obviously. I did this with a doctor, Dr. Michael Stroud, who is Britain's, well, Europe's really, top physiologist, specializing at Southampton University in studying stress nutrition and particularly the effects of starvation on the human body. So it is an element on this particular expedition. He monitored our daily calorific output at 11,500 calories a day each. We could only eat 5,000, that's all we could carry. We got skeletal rapidly. I set out from one side of the continent at 15.5 stone. By the halfway point at the pole, I was under 9 stone, despite eating 5,000 calories a day, towing 500-pound loads. I began to hate Mike. I have done 29 years of expeditions with him since then, but on that expedition, every 5 days he made you give blood, which I don't like anyway, for his experiments. Every 8 days he made you drink a container of liquid which cost $1,000, and for 24 hours after you drink it, any liquid coming out of your orifices has to be collected in bottles or you're in trouble, especially urine. And I have to say, outside at an average of -50 and a wind, filling a pee bottle can be very dangerous for that part of your body if you are male. Although, obviously, at that temperature, the difference between males and females is not great. You have your fingers get badly blistered. I had a big bit taken off here and put on my foot. I made a mistake for about 3 minutes, as a result of which 5 months later, again, Bristol, I had them all amputated. Just one little mistake in 3 minutes. You really don't want to make mistakes in those conditions. Mike and I eventually reached the far side of this great continent, first human beings to do it without support, today the longest unsupported polar journey in history. I don't have any pictures and I won't bore you any longer, so I will end at that. Altogether, Mike and I have raised £18.9 million from the expeditions for UK charities. All the expeditions have charity and a science programme, but from my point of view, that's not really it. As I said at the beginning, it happens to be my profession, and to continue to get sponsorship, we need to continue to beat our known rivals at all times. Roy, have you got time for questions or not?
We'll do, absolutely. For a start, wasn't that fascinating? Can we say thank you?